Hello everyone and welcome to Not a Doctor podcast with your host Mani, that is me. Before I start today's episode, I would like to talk a bit about the podcast and myself. So I'm a third-year medical student studying in Ireland, and I wanted to start this podcast because I'm a little lazy and I wanted to find a way to incentivize myself to read more articles. But I didn't want to sit behind a microphone and just babble on about scientific data and results and researches all the time. I wanted to include a bit of other aspects into these medical topics, so that's why you'll find today's episode is about medicalization. And yeah, let's talk about it. So first of all, a little bit of history. Medicalization, like other words with ization, means you make it into something. In this context, it's a medical thing. So it could be an aspect of life or something to do with the human body that became an illness. Now, the concept was first used by Jesse Pitts in 1968, who was a sociologist. And it was in the context of social control. It meant things you do to essentially control a person or groups of people. Now, Pitts thought that illness is a social construct. Later on, Irving Zola in 1972 wrote the first paper in medical sociology which used the term social control. He argued that instead of religion and law, medicine is now the main tool for social control. To quote, "It is becoming the new repository of truth, the place where absolute and often final judgments are made by supposedly moral, neutral, and objective experts." And his definition of medicalization was making medicine and the labels healthy and ill relevant to an ever-increasing part of human existence. Finally, one of the last people I wanted to mention while discussing the history of medicalization is Peter Conrad, and his paper in 1975 examining hyperkinesis, which is now known as ADHD, which brings us to a very important area of medicalization, mental illness. So Conrad described medicalization as the process of defining behavior as a medical problem or illness, and mandating or licensing the medical profession to provide some type of treatment for it. This is important because a social deviant behavior had been labeled as an illness now, because these children were not fitting into the social expectations and standards of behavior. And Conrad believes hyperkinesis was medicalized due to the pharmaceutical companies and governments taking action. This was because around that time, these companies were going through a pharmaceutical revolution as they were promoting psychoactive drugs for treating these children. He highlights an important fact of medicalization, that because it is doctors who are prescribing it and there's scientific evidence for how they work, we allow it to happen. Now, of course, as a science enthusiast and medical student myself, I'm all for evidence-based treatments. But an important negative consequence Conrad pointed out is the individualization of social problems, which makes people to look for causes and solutions to complex social problems in the individual rather than in the social system. This is very important, as it is removing the burden from governments to change societal structures in order to help the individuals who are considered deviants to be able to fit in more, but rather find solutions such as Ritalin or Adderall. Now, is medicalization good or bad? So far, the conversation we've had about it has been pretty negative, but let's look at the question from the point of view of a doctor and their patients. Gerhardt says that sociologists have been accused of ignoring the real clinical and symbolic benefits of medicalizations. And I wouldn't blame them because they're sociologists, which is why it's important that we look at the subject from different views. Conrad and Schneider believe that medicalization can reduce stigma around certain conditions, such as alcoholism. If we look at it as a disease, instead of blaming the person, we can accept that it's something that happens and we can try and help people who are suffering from it. On top of that, Broom and Woodward, in a paper in 1996, add on to this situation by pointing out that we can make these conditions a subject of research, find its symptoms, and find ways to cure and prevent it. Now, since this is a medicine-oriented podcast, I wanted to include clinical research so we observe what happens when a patient's condition is or isn't medicalized. And I found this great article by Broom and Woodward from 1996, which I quoted earlier on. And their article is about chronic fatigue syndrome. They say chronic fatigue syndrome has competing claims by different researchers and specialties. So there's no specific guideline in diagnosing someone with CFS. BNW, who I'll be referring to on from now, labels CFS as incompletely medicalized due to this and other surrounding controversies. Now they go along to say this makes doctors uncertain on how to guide their practice, but more importantly, it is a consequence of this on the patients. Imagine having your day-to-day life disrupted by this massive issue that some doctors might see it as a disease, and especially in the case of medical dominance, some won't see it as a disease. Can you imagine how hard that is? By the way, I checked, and it appears that CDS and NHS do consider CFS as a disease, but it depends on a lot of factors and there are some uncertainties. So hopefully in time we'd find better methods of diagnosis and treatments for it. And now let's move on to the patient's perspective. BNW reported that patients faced long delays before getting their conditions medicalized. And this is a normal thing that happens for people to consider their symptoms as serious mechanic states. Now, mechanic isn't a random mechanic, it is a researcher that BNW referenced in their paper. Now, all the patients started seeking medical attention once their symptoms were alarming, intrusive, or inconvenient. Patients would go to doctors with bad experiences and anxiety, wanting to know why they're no longer functioning as they normally could, why their day-to-day activities that were a routine is now becoming tiresome. These people went to doctors looking for insight informed by medical knowledge. When patients were becoming ill without a diagnosis, 86% said they became even sicker. They started losing their sense of self and identity because they weren't capable of being who they used to be. And they went through all of this without an explanation for their families or employment on top of everything else. Now, the helpful consultations that these patients received didn't necessarily have a diagnosis for them. What was helpful about the consultations was the doctor's responsiveness and respect for the patients. It was the doctors admitting that either they didn't know what was going on or there wasn't enough information out there regarding the patient's conditions. In the end, BNW found that 90% of patients identified diagnosis as the most helpful event in the course of their illness. So this form of medicalization is clearly constructive for people trying to cope with refractory illness. Antonovsky in 1987 said that the medical label allowed people to be able to begin seeing their lives as coherent and meaningful. Now, where does this leave us with medicalization? Well, in some cases, clearly it's both helpful and important for the patients and doctors to be able to come up with some sort of diagnosis, some conditions so that they can pave the way for starting to heal and feel better. But there's so many illnesses and conditions out there, and so many more are being found, it's really hard to tell when or if something should become medicalized. But I sincerely hope that we continue to respect each other and our experiences and try to be as empathetic as possible. And this is especially important for healthcare workers and us students who are going to be future healthcare professionals one day. Empathy and respect are going to always be important, and we have to keep that in mind, because in the end, it'll benefit patients and healthcare workers. Thank you so much for listening to my first episode. If you'd like to continue chatting about this with me, you can find me on Twitter at NI_BEYGI. And I hope that you looked into this more. Maybe if you're interested in it, some nice place to start off could be aging. Should aging become medicalized? Is aging an issue? If it is, would things like euthanasia be a way of treating it? Giving power to people to decide when they should die if they reach a certain age afterwards? Or do we even have to spend money and time looking into a treatment, quote unquote, for aging? You might see it as some natural event in life. I hope you have a lovely time of your own day whenever you're listening to this, and I will talk with you in the next episode. Bye-bye.